So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited to have you on here and have people from all over the country joining us as we continue our Coach Socialization series. Today we have Elana with us, who is the Safe Sport Lead for Sport Nova Scotia and who represents all of Nova Scotia, and who I have the honor of working with to continue our work with Safe Sport in Nova Scotia and continuing to inform coaches and parents and athletes and officials of how we can provide some safer sport environments. So today, Elana is just going to be reviewing kind of some things we've been working on in Nova Scotia and go through her background and some research she's done over the past few months and some things we've learned from other organizations. And then we're going to dive deep into the rule of two and how that can be a bit different now that we're in a virtual setting. So again, we'll just ask that you stick to the chat box during the presentation, and then we'll open up for a Q&A at the end. So I'll start sharing the presentation now, and then Elana, you can take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsty. And before my screen, I lost seeing all of you, but I recognize some familiar faces, which is lovely. And people who I've worked with since I started with Sport Nova Scotia in January, and I am grateful to them and all their guidance. And I see faces that I don't recognize, and I hope that one day soon even, that we can all come together and certainly continue these discussions that are really important. Kirsty understands, because we've done some work that requires, I guess, some tech savviness, and I don't have it. And I'd be the first to admit it, and I think Kirsty would second it. So she's going to share the presentation, and I'm going to sort of speak, and she'll direct the slides as we go along. As Kirsty mentioned, feel free to ask questions. I'll have sort of natural breaks, and if there's some pressing questions, Kirsty can see them and we can open it up, or we can save it to the end. Yeah, we can go from there. So I wanted to introduce myself because, again, I know some of you, we can move on to the slide because it's kind of cool. I wanted to introduce myself and just a bit about my background and how I got to be here. Again, some of you know, I was a freestyle skier, a competitive freestyle skier way back when this was a sport that existed. It doesn't exist other than the memes that are generated from it, if there are any, if people even want to go back that far. And as well, people make fun of it on YouTube, which I've seen, and every so often friends who used to ski competitive with me will share these videos that either I was a part of. But it was a really cool part of my life. I'm proud of being a freestyle skier, again, in a sport that doesn't exist anymore, and my kids think it's kind of cool. But I show this not only because it's cool, but because my background was an athletic background. I grew up skiing in a very athletic family. My family was heavily involved in football. So grew up in a sports family, and I loved being an athlete my entire life. I went to, back then in the 80s in Ontario, one of the first of its kind, a special school. It was had a fancy name, the Academy for Gifted Athletes. But really it was the first of its kind to allow students and athletes to pursue their athletic careers as well as staying strong in academics. And I'm honored for that opportunity. So much so that I thought I had wanted to be a sports psychologist. And I think there's probably some people who have maybe some background, and I really did, and I talked to my son about that last night, and I think, you know, if I had any regrets, it might be that, but I feel like I fulfilled my destiny with this new role. But in any event, I went to Western to pursue what I thought at that time was going to be a degree in sports psychology. Found the science a little challenging, to be honest with you. I went the kin route and ended up being a lawyer. So, you know, you can make lawyer jokes if you want, or you can't really because I can't see you, but feel free to share them at any other time. But interestingly enough, I ended up focusing on family, and in particular child protection. And so in a minute, I'll explain how this all comes together. But while I pursued my legal career, I stayed active in fitness, running marathons and dancing and yoga, and continued to fulfill and follow my love of athletics while maintaining my other passion, which was law and child protection and education. I ended up owning a gym in Halifax for a number of years, 5 years to be exact. And again, you know, my legal background was there in child protection, and this love for sport and athletics was always there. This job posting came up, I believe it was last November, I looked at and I thought, oh my God, like this is everything that it's come to. And then I ended up actually getting the job and think I truly have won the lottery, because it is a melding of child protection issues, education, and athletics. So that's me. Me, you know, full afro, the hair, everything. And that was me. And this is my road to being the safe sport lead in Nova Scotia. And I'm honored. I started in January, and I sort of joke that I was very, very excited. I had worked for a not-for-profit from home with the sweatpants, with the dog, with the kids, everything like that, and was really excited to come into an office environment, you know, get up every day, put on makeup, do my hair, and here I am back in sweatpants with the dog and the kids and so forth. So very excited to be doing this work. It's an exciting time. There's lots going on, and continue to do the hard work. And I go back to my initial comments. I'm very grateful to people that I could see when we had the screen full, for the people who have helped me. I saw, you know, Melissa, Natasha, Kirsty, obviously, who have helped me sort of find my feet and also hit the ground running in terms of safe sport in this province. So we can move on. I can just share a little bit about the background of safe sport. As most of you know, there was a federal mandate from Minister Duncan in 2019. I'm just going to read it, sort of a quote that comes out of that, is that harassment of any kind is completely unacceptable. And the safety and security of athletes, coaches, and officials is always our top priority. We all must play a role in protecting our young people and our athletes, to speak up when we see something that doesn't seem quite right, and to listen, really listen to our athletes. And most importantly, to act when the situation demands it, to ensure our athletes always have the support they need from us. And that has really sort of shaped the work for safe sport in this country. Some was going on before, but really that was the beginning of a lot of work that has happened since, including Sport Can and the adoption of the UCCMS. And that's an acronym I've learned in this job. There are a lot of acronyms. I'm still learning. Someone sent me a cheat sheet one day of different acronyms, the Universal Code of Conduct Against Maltreatment in Sport. And so right now that code is out there. How it's going to play with our PSOs and our CSOs and what we're going to end up doing with it is still a work in progress. Since I started in January, I immediately sort of sat down and conducted some research. And what is out there in safe sport? What are other jurisdictions doing across the country, across the world, and taking from those jurisdictions and saying, okay, this is something we can use. This is something that I think we can sort of put on the shelf. And what are the best practices? So a lot of jurisdictional research and writing notes and making memos. I've had discussions and consultations with key stakeholders from NSOs, PSOs, CSOs, everybody as I can speak to. And again, if anybody wants to speak to me after this, please feel free. The more I learn, the better I am, I think, at doing my job and helping frame the safe sports strategy for Nova Scotia. So a lot of discussions. I joked about Christy helping me technology-wise. We did a PSO survey, and that was really critical. Nancy was on there. I don't know if she's on here now. And we had a safe sport working, or I guess it was then called a task force. It's since changed into a working group. And we thought it was important to find out where our PSOs in the province are with respect to safe sport. What are their policies? What is their education like? And also really important to me was, what are the barriers? So if they are experiencing barriers, what are they? And then learning from them and helping to maybe eradicate or lessen the barriers. And that becomes important in the future of the work we do, is the barriers. Many of you know Mike Hudson, and Mike Hudson and I have worked quite closely together in terms of trying to create a safe sports strategy and discuss minimum standards across the province, including policies and procedures, minimum standards for background screening and education, and the creation of an independent, third-party complaints process, because I see that as critical in moving forward. And just to go back in terms of the education, as you probably, or most of you know, there is that safe sport education that has recently come out. I believe it was April 1st. And we're talking about that as being a minimum standard. It's not certainly set in stone at this time, but that's one of the things that we talk about. We're also talking about things like parent and athlete education, and it certainly wouldn't be mandatory, but we think, and I'll talk about this as we go through some of the Rule of Two discussion, about how consistency is really important in terms of making sure that we're all talking from the same page, that we all understand the whys. And so if we can create parent awareness campaigns or education, athlete awareness campaigns and education, then some of these discussions may actually be in fact easier to have, and there may be greater understanding and less gray areas, because I know, as we'll talk in a minute, the Rule of Two is one of those areas where there's a lot of grayness. We can move forward, and I was just going to go into actually talking about the responsible coaching movement just briefly, because I believe, and I had a sort of brief conversation with Kirsty before, most of you would be familiar with the responsible coaching movement. There's a link at the end of this presentation that you can, if you haven't come across it, you certainly can. The Coaching Association of Canada has created the responsible coaching movement, and basically it's a call to action for sport organization, parents and coaches to enact responsible coaching across Canada on and off the field. And the idea is to improve practices that ensure the health, safety, and well-being of all participants. So again, if you haven't come in contact or aren't familiar with the responsible coaching movement, I highly encourage you to do so. There's three main steps, or three, I guess three parts to the responsible coaching movement, including the Rule of Two, the other two being background screening, the ethics training, and again, if you're not familiar, I highly encourage you to go into that. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the Rule of Two, sort of the Rule of Two in general, and then maybe go a little bit deeper into the Rule of Two as it relates to a virtual environment, because really, as we all know, virtual reality is our reality these days, and we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know how long we'll be doing these training sessions in a virtual world, as well as we don't know if it's going to come back. So it's a great time to really talk about it, to bring in any issues or questions up front, as well as to prepare if we should have this going on in the future. So we can move on. So this is a slide that, again, if you're familiar with the responsible coaching movement and the Rule of Two, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, other than to say, when talking about the Rule of Two, I think it's really important, obviously, to be aware of the steps and the gold standard, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I think it's really important to remember the why, that the purpose of the Rule of Two is to protect minor athletes and coaches in potentially vulnerable situations by ensuring more than one adult is present. So remembering when you ask those questions, and when you maybe come up against those gray situations, to remember the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about the Rule of Two? And again, it's to protect the athletes and coaches in vulnerable or potentially vulnerable situations. We talk a lot about, you'll hear the language, open and observable environments, and I think that's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about it, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide, but I just wanted to highlight, keeping in mind, we're talking best practices here. So the gold standard, as most of you are probably aware, would be 2 certified and screened coaches plus 1 athlete. And then you'll see as we go down on the scale, the sort of is 1 coach. So the 1 coach, 1 athlete, and then it's a scale as we move forward. And we're always trying to, whether it's as a coach, sport org, whatever that is, to reach the gold standard, recognizing that that is not always possible, but aiming towards that. And so I think we also, when we think about the why of the Rule of Two, is to think about best practices. And so how can we as a coach, how can we as an organization, how can we as a parent, and being familiarizing ourselves with the Rule of Two, how can we work towards achieving that gold standard? So just a few comments about best practices before we get, and this is more in the physical environment, but before we get into the virtual, and Kirsty, if you want to move on. And these are sort of some of the key features when we talk about the Rule of Two. Good practices to implement. So ensuring a coach is never alone and out of sight with a participant without another screened coach or screened adult. So again, the ideal, the gold standard would be the 2 screened and certified coaches. Right, next to that, in terms of best practice, would be another screened parent or volunteer who would be present. Allowing the training to happen in an open and observable environment is really critical. That's sort of the key to the Rule of Two, making sure that nothing is happening behind closed doors. In terms of travel, ensuring a participant rides in a coach ensuring that a participant ride in a coach's vehicle with another adult present. So it's not a one-on-one coach driving athlete home. Considering the gender of the participant when selecting the screen coaches is something that should be considered, and eliminating one-on-one electronic messaging and ensuring that all communications are sent to the group and include parents. And we're going to dive into that one a little bit more as I see that coming up a lot in conversations. I did a similar presentation last night. This was the topic of a lot of conversation. I have a 17 and a 16-year-old, and we talk a lot about this all the time, ensuring that one-on-one communication doesn't happen. So I'll sort of, Christy, unless there's anything that's come up, I see 4, but I don't know, it might be just like, hi, how are you, or I can't hear you, but I will continue on unless there's some pressing questions about the rule of 2 sort of in a physical environment. And I don't see you saying anything, Christy, so. Okay, again, we can certainly take questions and have discussions at the end. And I think one of the things I also wanted to say, and I didn't say it at the beginning, is that I might not have the answers, and feel free to ask me either here or feel free to send me a message directly, and I will do my best to get you those answers. So I will be the first to admit it if I don't have the answers, or I need to have a discussion with someone, and I will promise you that I will do my best to get you an answer, or at least have a discussion about how we would get an answer. So just again, feel free to ask those questions. So the rule of 2 in a virtual setting, and this obviously has come up more in the latest time in our world. Basically, it should continue. The rule of 2 should continue to apply to all minor athletes in the virtual environment during COVID-19. And additionally, for those under 16, a parent or guardian should be present during the session where possible. It is recommended that the rule of 2 apply to non-minor athletes as well in the current circumstances. And again, going back to that gold standard, and there is a slide, and I will share it in a minute, but for every session, the rule of 2 would require 2 adult coaches to be present, or 1 coach and 1 adult. Ideally, again, and we're talking best practices, and when we think about the why, one-on-one sessions should be prohibited. What's really important too is that a clear statement of professional standards expected of the coach should be communicated. So as coach would tell the parent, this is what we're going to be doing, this is why we're going to be doing it, related to the sport or the training or the coaching. So it's not a social engagement. We can move on. There's again, just a few slides about the rule of 2 in a virtual setting that I'm going to share with you. Parents and guardians should be fully informed beforehand about the activities. So what are we going to be doing? How long is the session? So fully informed about the session and the activities that are going to be taken, as well as the process. Consenting parents and guardians should be consenting to the virtual sessions. So prior to each session, if it's irregularly scheduled. Having said that, if it's a series of, we're going to do 8 weeks, Wednesdays at 2 o'clock, then the consent is probably okay if that's if the parents or guardians give that consent prior to the group of training activities. Communication, and again, this goes back to the basic principles behind the rule of 2. Communication during each session should be in an open and observable environment. So avoiding bedrooms in the athlete's home or the athlete's parents or guardians' home. And the same thing, the coach must initiate the session from an appropriate location. So avoiding their own bedroom, personal settings, and so forth. We'll talk a little bit, there's the Center for Child Protection has some other key features, which I'll talk about right at the end, but obviously wearing professional attire for both. And where the capacity exists, to record those sessions as well, and to keep it on a platform that your organization sanctions as well. And we can move on. This is a lot to do with the communication with your athletes, prohibiting one-on-one texting, emailing, or online between coaches and athletes. So any texting, emailing, and online contact should be limited to group text or email that involve 2 adults. It could be 2 coaches, again, the gold standard being 2 coaches, screen coaches, or 1 coach and including a parent or a guardian volunteer. And limited to coaching of coaching matters, so non-social matters are not acceptable, and parents of minor athletes should be provided the opportunity to receive the texts and emails. One of the things that has come up, and again, Mike has shared with me, and this may be relevant to some of you, is Team Snap. Is just one example, and I don't have shares in Team Snap. I haven't seen it, but I know that Team Snap is a platform where coaches can send group texts to athletes, and there's always a record of that. Again, thinking about best practices, thinking about gold standards, making sure that those one-on-one communications aren't there. Social media contact between coach and athlete should be prohibited. So no sharing memes, non-training videos, and things like that. Encouraging the parents, and again, this is where parent education and athlete education is important, I think, and as we go forward, we're going to be working on that and looking at that. Encouraging parents and guardians to debrief with the athlete about virtual training. So ask the athletes, you know, what happened, how was it, and get just a sense of what happened. So follow up with that training. We can move on. This is something that, again, if you go into, I believe it's CAC, where I pulled it from, but it's the rule of 2 in a virtual setting. And again, we're talking about best practices, gold standard, that in a virtual training environment, there would be 2 trained and screened coaches and 1 athlete. Again, moving down sort of the ladder, the 1 trained coach and the parent. And basically the idea is that it's not the one-on-one, which is the same as the physical environment. And so keeping in mind the key things, the why are we doing this? We're protecting coaches and athletes from vulnerable situations, keeping in mind best practices and gold standards, and open and observable. So if we keep those things in mind, we might be able to work around some of the settings or some of the situations that have come up. And again, protecting those people in vulnerable situations. Just going to highlight, and then I'm going to share with you some additional resources and just share with you some of the comments that were made by the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. So Christy, if you just want to sort of highlight this next slide, and the responsible coaching movement. Again, I encourage you, if you haven't been there, some of you have probably been there a lot, but they are putting on new information, especially as we do go through COVID and talk about training and coaching in a virtual environment. As well, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection has released some information. I put the link there. But again, I just want to share with you a few of the key features that sort of highlight, as well as sort of supplement some of the things that I've said today, and I'll just read a few of those for you. So basically, suggested best practices include applying professional standards to all online interactions with athletes and parents, keep communication goal-oriented and tied to outcomes for specific programs, keep all forms of communication transparent by including parents on all correspondence, follow your organization's privacy policies regarding posting any digital pictures or any other identifying information on social media or websites, setting appropriate restrictions to maximize your privacy on your personal social media accounts, ensuring that athletes cannot view or post content, refrain from sending or accepting friend requests from athletes or liking or commenting on their posts or social media accounts, and ensure transparency during video chat discussions with athletes located in common high traffic areas, as well as proper clothing attire must be worn. And the questions would be to ask, would a parent or guardian consider my interaction as reasonable and professional? So those are some of the big things to keep in mind. Best practices, again, I encourage you to also check with your organization that you're coaching with, and they may have a rule of 2 policy or a safe sport policy that either talks about this further or supplements the things that I have said today. So those are some of the key features of the rule of 2, and specifically the rule of 2 in a virtual setting that maybe you hadn't thought about, or maybe hopefully I brought to your attention today and we can have a discussion about it. Again, I encourage you to ask questions. If you want to ask me questions here, or if you feel, I know it was short and brief, but if you feel you'd rather reach out to me directly, I'm happy to have that as well. So if there's any questions. I don't know how Christy does this with so many people.
There's lots of tabs opened, which is why it takes me a second to switch screens. I have received one question privately. So in a virtual training session, if there's one coach and then an athlete group, is that okay or not okay?
Yeah, and that would be on the scale. If we look at I don't know if you can do that as at the same time, um, pull up that virtual settings slide. Um, again, we're taught best practices, so we want to make sure that it's in an open and observable environment. I think it was like 3 slides ago. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. The one right after this, Kirsty. There's the pictograph, or there we go. So one coach, 2 athletes. Again, if we think about the why and why we're doing this to protect vulnerable athletes, so the more we can make sure that we are in an open and observable. If we have one coach and multiple athletes, we're certainly not at the bottom. Ideally, we would have another parent there, or another screen coach, ideally, like if we want to reach the gold standard. But I think we have to again keep in mind best practices. So to answer the question, it's not the gold standard, but it is, it is, as long as that training was in an open and observable environment. And we want to make sure that we are thinking about best practices and how we can protect coaches and athletes in these situations.
Totally. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to fire away, send me a message, put it in the group chat, or
send me a message.
Yeah, send Elana a message, or unmute yourself too. I just received another one.
Okay.
So when it comes to background screenings,
Yeah.
what are red flags or criminal charges that are not allowing coaches or volunteers to work with athletes?
That's an excellent question. I can only see my rule of 2 slide, which is fine. It's an excellent question, and we are working on that. And one of the things that we're working on in terms of our proposal for minimum standards of background screening is also the creation of what we call a decision tree, or decision-making tree. So, and I know some of the NSOs and some PSOs have adopted those, that if you do get a positive criminal record check, what are the questions to be asked? So I think that is, it's an excellent question. I don't have an answer for you right now, but we are working on it. And I promise, whether it's with Kirsty or whoever shares this information with you, I promise that information will be disseminated as soon as we have it. So I'm not evading the question. It's just something that we're working on now.
Yeah, I think I asked you that question like a week or 2 ago, and now we're...
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
And I sent it right back, and I said, we're working on it. I'll let you know.
Yeah. Someone just asked, what's the next steps in Sport Nova Scotia in regards to safe sport? What new initiatives are you working on?
Awesome question. Thank you. And actually, I didn't say this at the beginning. My biggest thing when I started was, I looked on our website and I said, uh-oh, we don't have anything about safe sports. So we wanted, and I work with the working group, or then task force, and Melissa and Kirsty and some other people. And we came up with a statement and the values that we believe in. And safe sport, to me, and I think a lot of people that I work with, and a lot of people in this province, around the country, it is freedom from abuse, harassment, and discrimination, but it also means welcoming and inclusive and belonging. And that frames a lot of the work that I believe in doing, and a lot of work I have been doing so far. So in addition to some of the things like the background screening minimum standards, the education, working with Melissa and Kirsty, actually we have a call this week with True Sport to see if we can get some training to our coaches on True Sport. I'm on some diversity and inclusion task forces. I'm on a women and girls task force as well. So really looking at safe sport, big picture safe sport. So again, it is an absolute requirement to have freedom from maltreatment, is the language that's now being used, abuse, harassment, and discrimination in the past, but also that big picture. What does it mean to feel safe in sport? I want, and I sort of, again, show those pictures at the beginning, I want young people, old people, middle-aged people to come away from their sporting and recreation experiences feeling positive, telling good stories, sharing great memories. And if we can all work together to create a safe environment and safe again in big picture, then I think I will have done my job, or at least work towards my job with some amazing people that I'm working with. So again, working with the government, just going back into those initiatives, some of those trainings, as I said, parent and athlete education training, or social media campaigns, however we decide, and working with key stakeholders. So again, if anybody wants to reach out to me and say, I really want to work with you on this, please do. Working with key stakeholders to see how we can deliver the best education across the province. Hopefully sharing it with other provinces, learning from other provinces, working on an independent complaints process. That's something that's really, really critical to me and the work that we're doing, and will take a lot of work. So those are some of the big pictures. Christy and I know Melissa's here, Tash is here, I think, as well. If am I missing anything that we've been working on, sort of big picture? I don't know.
Well,
I feel like I probably am. But.
Someone just asked about what might be the timeline on the Nova Scotia independent investigative process. So like, I know that's something that you and Mike have been working on. So do you have any insight on how long that might take?
Yeah, it's funny because and I say I'm funny, but it's big. It's really big. It's the who's, it's the process. It's looking at other jurisdictions. So I wish I could give a timeline. The only thing I can say, it is a priority in terms of working on that and getting that done. And I say done because I don't know when that will be, but it is an absolute priority for me to start the process. And I've done a lot of research and asked a lot of questions, a lot of experts in the field, including from other jurisdictions, including people within our own jurisdiction, about how their process works when we talk about independent complaints process, and the notion of being unbiased and investigation and things like that. So I promise whoever asked that question, and I guess to everybody here, is that that's something that we're working on.
Okay, great. And another question came in. So what discussions do you cover in parent education? So yeah.
Good question, because we haven't done it yet, but if anybody here would like to work with me and with Christy, and I know Melissa, and we've talked about this. It was something, again, I've been with Sport Nova Scotia since January, I guess, and you know, there's a lot of emphasis on coach education, as there should be, and I think it's valuable and important, and we continue that work. But again, I believe in consistency. So in terms of getting the information out to parents as well, that's something that we've just put it out there, as that's something that we see as a need in terms of parent education and awareness. And so how we're going to go about doing that, what are the first topics we're going to cover? Maybe it is a rule of two social media campaign. I don't know yet what it is, but it is something, again, one of these priorities that is right up there for me in terms of making people aware that we're all working from the same page. And I used the example last night, it's happened, or it's been brought up when we've talked about this in a university setting, when a coach says, I can't have the door closed anymore. And so the athlete sort of says, well, why, why not? And so that we all understand what this rule of two means, what is now the best practice and why we're doing it. So really, again, the best practices and the why, I think, is really important to make sure everybody understands.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And I know we're all coaches here, so if you're having like a parent meeting with your athletes and with your parents at the beginning of every season, there's no harm in bringing up this kind of stuff, even giving out handouts, and no matter the age group too. Like, I work with athletes as young as 5 years old, and I still talk to my athletes and parents about rule of two and the importance of background screening and making sure another parent's always present. So have those tough conversations. Any more questions?
And Christy, I think that's really important, and family and we talked a lot about, age appropriate and having these discussions with, and that's sort of another topic for another day, but having these discussions with athletes. And again, maybe it is something that Sport Nova Scotia can create, is sort of a one pager, and I can't remember who I talked about it, and if they're here on this call, then shout out and put your hand up. But having a one-pager to give out to parents during registration, for example, to talk about some of these issues, that might be an idea as we go forward. So again, I am always open to discussion. I'm learning. I guess it's been 5 months really only, and I'm learning, and I really welcome any discussions, ideas. So please, again, feel free to reach out to Christy or myself, or yeah. I saw a hi Elana in the chat box, but I don't want to touch anything. So I'm going to, Christy, you can take that from me.
Yeah.
I will shut this down. I will leave here and you guys will never see me. So I'm not going to touch anything.
They may have sent you a message privately though. So
okay, then I'll figure that out.
Okay. If that is the case, so just send it to me and I can ask it. Okay. So what are some different hurdles between team and individual sports in terms of safe sport?
That's a really good question. And it's a really good question now. The one-on-one, right? The one-on-one, the coaching. So I guess if we're talking gold standards, I don't know what the opposite of gold standard is, no standard, in terms of training and coaching. So it's in a one-on-one sport, an individual sport. I think that's obviously harder. Some of the smaller sports have, and this came up during a discussion last night, and I think it's a discussion, said, we're in a small community. We don't have 2 screened coaches. And I think that's something that, we talked about. But again, if we keep in mind the why and the best practices, having a parent involved and making sure that there's that open and observable environment, we can, I don't want to say get around, but we can work with this and certainly ask the questions of your organization. Reach out to me and ask the question. And again, if I don't have the answer, in terms of, I'm trying to think in group, and maybe someone else can jump in terms of, because you as coaches would probably be more aware of what safe sport barriers or issues have you come up in terms of working with team athletes. Is there anybody else who feels comfortable in raising that or talking about this?
I mean, I only work with a team sport, but I know for individual sport, I can imagine a huge barrier would be following rule of 2, especially when you may have an athlete approaching with confidential stuff. So for example, I've had some athletes approach me about like personal issues. So like whether that be like a mental health or an eating disorder or something like that, they'll approach me with a friend. They might not feel comfortable approaching you with a parent or with a fellow screen coach. So I can imagine that would be a barrier. And my biggest suggestion would either be to find a team within that individual sport. Like I know, even though an individual sport is individual athletes, they are still a team. So making sure they have a friend to approach you with, and then maybe having a fellow coach handy at all times. There's definitely no harm in traveling as a pack. I know this came up in our Women in Sport panel last night. It's actually great for coaches to always be together so that if a situation does arise where an athlete approaches you individually, at least that coach is still next to you to handle the situation. But individual sport coaches, please feel free to speak up. I'm just speaking from my experience and some research I've done, but yeah.
I think I saw Natasha say something about travel.
Yeah, so just ensuring that you have either a screened, and if you don't have a screened coach, like even like Elana said, like a parent that is screened is so important.
Yeah, and keep in mind, sorry, Christy, to interrupt.
No.
Keep in mind that some of your, if you work for PSO or CSO, some of your organizations will have travel policies that lay this out as well. So keep in mind that those policies probably do exist.
And then someone just asked about the challenges working with mixed gender team. So.
And again, the idea, again, I think I mentioned in one of the slides back, is just keeping in mind that there is someone of the same gender in those sort of 2 coaches, 1 athlete situation, and keeping those best practices in mind. Again, that might not always be able. So again, we look at, can we get a screen parent or volunteer to be that second adult in the room or in the coaching situation.
And just on the travel note too, I will add in if your PSO doesn't have a travel policy or anything, like look to your NSO, so your national sport organization, or like follow up with me or Elana. We can definitely provide resources for that. Because in terms of gender, especially, it's really important that there's different rooms. So if you have a male coach and female athletes, they cannot be in the same room, and there has to be a female adult there present as well. So definitely important to follow those policies. All right, any last questions? I'm just scrolling through, making sure I don't miss anything, but.
Again, I encourage you, if there are no questions or you would rather reach out to me or Christy directly, please do. I'm excited to continue to work, and this is ever evolving. We didn't think we'd have, certainly when I started, we didn't think we would be having a Zoom call with 40 plus people and talking about this stuff. And so again, please feel free to reach out. And if there's follow-up, I'll share information as I get it in terms of initiatives as we move forward in Sport Nova Scotia. Those will be shared with Christy as well. And she will probably be leading some of them as well with me in terms of the work we're doing. So we'll certainly share whatever best practices we come across, information. One of the things, again, about Sport Nova Scotia, we put a definition of safe sport on our website. We included resources, and those resources will continue to grow as we continue to get more information. So I promise the website, I think, is going through a revamp. But there will be resources. I know that CSCA has lots of resources on their website as well. So in terms of safe sport.
Yeah, I'll just plug CSC. CSCatlantic.ca is our website, and it's right in the top bar. It says safe sports. We have resources for every Atlantic province, and then some safe sport training there as well. And I'll start by closing by saying that if anyone hasn't taken the CAC safe sport training, I definitely recommend you do that. It doesn't take more than 90 minutes. Like, I know some people that have gone through it in 60 minutes, so it's definitely worth your time. A lot of great information and a lot of resources that you can take from it as well. So definitely look into that. And then from there, if you're a coach based out of Nova Scotia, our VIP program is a great way to get your Commit to Kids and Respected Sport training and your Make Ethical Decisions training for free. So that will save you like $100. So definitely look into that if you're interested in continuing your safe sport and your ethical literacy. But with that, we'll wrap it up. So thank you so much, Elana, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's a rainy day in Nova Scotia. We've had some sunny days the past couple of weeks, so it's a perfect day to sit down and learn more about safe sport. So thank you so much, Elana, and we hope to see you guys tomorrow morning. We have Cindy Tai coming on to talk about coach as a performer. So definitely another session that will be great, and we encourage you all to come out 10 a.m. Atlantic time. So thank you.
Be safe, everyone, and thank you for spending the afternoon with me. Thank you.
Thanks.